Today I'll be discussing the former Lucchese boss, Carmine Tramunti, who was referred to by several nicknames, including Grips. Carmine Tramunti's story began with his birth on October 1st, 1910, in Naples, Italy, a country with strong roots and rich with cultural heritage. When Tramunti was 3 years old, his parents made a life-changing decision and immigrated with his sisters and him to the United States. The Tramuntis settled, like most Italian immigrants before them, in East Harlem. As far as his education, he made it to the 7th grade before leaving school to begin working, although prior to him leaving, he spent some time in reform school for truancy. Tramunti held legitimate jobs, such as a laborer for an electrical company in Long Island City, as well as working for a clothing factory in Manhattan. Despite trying to make an honest living, the streets of Harlem presented temptations and pitfalls, and he quickly became involved in criminal activities. His arrest record dates back to 1922 and included crimes such as robbery, assault, gambling, disorderly conduct, vagrancy, and was once the suspect in the shooting of 2 men. In addition, he had numerous charges of criminal contempt for refusing to testify. In 1930, he was arrested for robbing a rent collector, but those charges were dropped for lack of evidence, which provides a glimpse into that era where witness refusal was common, making it difficult to prosecute cases. A turning point for Tramunti took place on May 23, 1931, when during an armed robbery, he discharged a pistol at a New York City policeman. This time, the consequences were severe, and Tramunti was sentenced to 6 to 15 years in Sing Sing prison. He was released from prison in 1938, but his freedom was short-lived, and he found himself back behind bars for a parole violation. By the late 1930s, early 1940s, Tramunti was inducted into the family led by Tommaso Gagliano, which leadership was based in the Bronx and Harlem. He would also marry his wife Lillian during the early 1940s. Initially, they lived with her parents on East 112th Street in East Harlem. The couple would have 3 children, a daughter and 2 sons, and eventually moved to 14579 6th Avenue in Whitestone, Queens. Like most mobsters of that era, Tramunti was involved in the numbers racket, loan sharking, gambling, which included running upscale dice games in New York and Florida. He was also involved in labor unions, especially Teamster Local 239, which the Lucchese's controlled. And throughout the 1940s, Tramunti was recognized as an asset to the family and was placed in a captain position by the early 1950s. At the time, the family's namesake, Tommy Lucchese, was the boss of the family and was considered very friendly with Tramunti. In mid-April 1957, a U.S. Senate Select Committee held hearings led by Robert Kennedy, who served as chief counsel. The committee was investigating improper activities in the labor and management field, specifically the waste management industry. Despite the committee's numerous attempts to subpoena Tramunti, they were unable to locate him because he went on a lam to avoid being served for 5 months. The committee had better luck serving fellow Lucchese captain Anthony Tony Ducks Corallo. The committee was interested in the Lucchese's ties to Sunrise Sanitation, as well as Bernard Allenstein, the secretary-treasurer of the sanitation local. In the late 1960s, Tommy Lucchese was diagnosed with a brain tumor, and prior to his death, on July 13, 1967, he picked Tony Ducks to be his successor. However, Tony Ducks had legal troubles and was indicted in December 1967 for receiving kickbacks from a construction contractor, and was indicted again for bribing a water commissioner, in which he received a 4.5-year sentence in February 1970. As a result, Gambino boss Carlo Gambino, a close friend of Tramunti, advocated for him with the commission to be approved to take the Lucchese family over. And Tramunti, consequently, was placed in a quasi-boss position. As it was understood, he would be warming the seat until Tony Ducks was released. In 1969, Tramunti was convicted for refusing to answer questions before a Bronx grand jury and sentenced to a year, but that conviction was overturned on appeal. In February 1970, he was subpoenaed before the Joint Legislative Committee on Crime. And here's a picture of him waiting to appear before the committee alongside Colombo captain Mimi Shallow. On November 19, 1970, a federal grand jury indicted Tramunti and a dozen others for stock fraud, in which they sold unregistered stock, as well as committed mail and wire fraud and extortion. He was acquitted after a trial on December 23, 1971. By this time, naturally, Tramunti was under constant surveillance by law enforcement. One of the places he was followed to was a business called Vario's Bargain Auto Parts, which operated out of a blue and gray trailer in a junkyard at 5702 Avenue D in Canarsie, Brooklyn, headquarters of the Lucchese consigliere, Paulie Vario. In fact, Vario was indicted in November 1972 as a result of a bug that was planted in the trailer and was charged with tampering with a witness for advising someone to Lamont, Florida, to avoid appearing before a grand jury. Besides illegal activities, Tramunti was involved in legitimate businesses as well, like a trucking company called Imperial Trucking, a Manhattan florist shop named after his daughter, Rosalie's Florist, and he also invested in nightclubs around New York, including the Pussycat and the Bachelor 3 on Lexington Avenue, where New York Jets Joe Namath was allegedly a partner. Tramunti was indicted again on November 29, 1972, on 3 counts of criminal contempt, which involved 3 phone calls he made to Vario's trailer in Canarsie. A bug picked him up identifying himself as Mr. Gribbs. In one call, Tramunti told Vario it was very, very important he meet him at 114th Street and Broadway in the city. When the grand jury questioned Tramunti as to what was so urgent, he said he couldn't remember. In previous questions regarding Vario, Tramunti told the grand jury he had no business with him, either economically or socially, which made him seem like he was withholding information. He was ultimately convicted of contempt on May 30th, 1973, and when sentenced on August 6, 1973, the judge gave him 3 years. The district attorney trying the case told the judge, "I am convinced the defendant holds the key to unlocking the mysteries of organized crime." On October 4th, 1973, while serving his sentence for the criminal contempt charge, Tramunti and over 40 Gigi and Gleese were indicted on conspiracy charges for the distribution and sale of narcotics. Tramunti was named as the top guy and the financer of the French Connection, where heroin was trafficked from France. The trial began on January 21st, 1974, where the government's key witness, Frank Stasi, testified. Stasi was an associate of Tramunti who was arrested for narcotics paraphernalia in May 1972. He served the coffee in a Bronx social club and claimed that he overheard a conversation between Fat Gigi and Tramunti. According to Stasi, Fat Gigi told Tramunti, "I expect some goods. I'm going to need some money." And Tramunti nodded his head. On a side note, allegedly, Carmine Tramunti was the inspiration for the character, Dominic Cantano, in the movie American Gangster. Please remember to hit the like icon if you haven't already. And if anyone wants to show their appreciation for this video or help keep this podcast going, you know what to do. And thank you. During the investigation, on February 3rd, 1973, Vincent Papa and Joe DiNapoli were driving in a green Pontiac. Earlier, law enforcement spotted DiNapoli putting a suitcase in the back seat. They pulled the Pontiac over at the intersection of East Tremont Avenue and Castle Hill Avenue in the Bronx. When they opened the suitcase, they found $1 million in cash. The prosecutor was permitted to tell the jury about the money and then explain that the narcotics business was conducted as a business operation with managers, suppliers, customers, and a banker or financer who provided the capital. And he identified Tramunti as the financer. On March 13, 1974, the jury came back with a guilty verdict. During his sentencing on May 7, 1974, Tramunti addressed the court and said the following: "I may be a mobster and may have done bad things, but I am not a drug dealer." And despite being convicted for nodding his head, the judge sentenced Tramunti to 15 years. On October 15, 1978, Carmine Tramunti died of natural causes while at the federal prison in Springfield, Missouri.